What's the question you find yourself returning to that you think the rest of us aren't asking yet?
I think less and less about the law and less about tech by themselves.
Since January 20th, 2025, what's the most consequential thing that you've worked on, and why would you think it's consequential?
Yeah, it's a really good question.
Your opening question is so provocative. Where to go? I could go to ancient Greece. We can go to the 1400s and the UK. But I honestly think the answer is we're dealing with both things. The First Amendment is
The First Amendment may be the most admired provision of the Constitution. It's also one of the most misunderstood. Americans like to believe the First Amendment is self-executing, that once speech is protected, it's safe. It isn't. Having represented journalists, advocates, and community leaders, people like Sami Hamdi, Yaqub Ira, I've watched the government find other tools. You don't prosecute someone for their speech. You target their immigration status, their tax filings, their funding sources, and associations. You surveil them, deplatform them, freeze their assets, transfer them to solitary. You make the cost of speaking so high that most people choose silence without anyone having to say a word. And you do it in a country that considers itself the world's leading democracy. At June's end, 8 people were sentenced in Fort Worth, some to decades in federal prison for their roles in a 4th of July protest outside an ICE detention center in Alvarado, Texas. One man received 30 years, in part for transporting a box of political zines he didn't write. The government called the zines evidence of a criminal ideology. That's the country we're in right now. My guests today have spent their careers mapping the gap between what the First Amendment promises and what it actually delivers. Seth Stern is the Director of Advocacy at the Freedom of the Press Foundation, a First Amendment lawyer and journalist who has spent years fighting for press freedom from courtrooms to prison visiting rooms. Nora Benavidez is Senior Counsel and Director of Digital Justice and Civil Rights at Free Press. She's a civil rights attorney who thinks at the intersection of law, tech, and democratic survival. She is spending the year writing a book about free speech and democratic erosion that I believe will matter for a long time. I want to know where the First Amendment is working, where it is failing, and whether anything can close the distance between those two things. Thank you both for joining me on this episode of Witness. I'd love to start off with you, Nora. Nora, the First Amendment was designed to protect unpopular speech, but it increasingly seems like the speech most likely to trigger government scrutiny is speech that challenges American foreign policy, coverage of Gaza, advocacy around Palestine, protest at an ICE facility. Is that perception accurate, or are we telling ourselves too simple a story?
Well, thanks, Miriam, for having me and for Seth. It's a wonderful combination, I have to say. Your opening question is so provocative. Where to go? I could go to ancient Greece. We can go to the 1400s and the UK. But I honestly think the answer is we're dealing with both things. The First Amendment is elusive and I believe incredibly valuable. It's worth fighting for. But the premise of the First Amendment is never perfect. And in fact, we've always seen that dissent, minority voices, minority perspectives have always been under the most aggressive forms of attack, with or without the First Amendment as our framework. If we go back centuries, we know that people who were writing in British royal 1400 era, speaking about the need for the crown to be accountable to the people, one of those individuals was killed and dismembered for his writing. We know that early American colonial times also saw factions of people that, if there were dissenting perspectives, they were essentially castigated from their communities. They were run out of town, literally. We've seen dissenting views from the Red Scare period, both of them, and through the modern surveillance apparatus that targets and monitors people for our views. So I actually think both things can be true, actually, that on the one hand, speech is always valuable, that we do need more speech. And I hope we get into some of the ways that people self-censor, that so much of the fear riddled across our communities is very real right now. But I could never sit here and say that the targeting of free speech is equitable. It is always inequitable. And I see Seth nodding because we know that to be true, that it is women, it is people of color, it is the kinds of views that cause the most friction that the government and those in power typically want removed that are then removed. And, free speech is uncomfortable. It should make us uncomfortable. Views that push the boundaries of who should be free or push the boundaries of what values we should hold. Those are the kinds of values and speech and rhetoric that we should hear about. And yet more and more that gets sidelined and as we've seen throughout history, criminalized. So dissenting viewpoints now that try to shine a light on gross detention facility conditions, those people are now getting sentences upwards of 30 to 100 years in prison. People who are protesting gross ICE presence and various kinds of violent killings from our government officials, those people are also now facing network crime charges. And so we're in this environment where dissent is itself considered almost dirty or criminal. And that is antithetical to the First Amendment, and it's antithetical to the way democracies thrive. Because we thrive when we have a diversity of viewpoints and when everyone, irrespective of class or creed or gender or other value holding belief, is able to come to the table and express and engage with the issues.
You said so many beautiful and thoughtful things. Seth, I hope you can top that. The Freedom of the Press Foundation was founded in an era defined by Snowden and WikiLeaks. Has the nature of the threat to press freedom changed, or has it intensified along familiar lines?
I would say that it's changed in a number of ways. It's become more direct, it's become more widespread, and tactics that were once seen as arising from one-off cases involving rogue prosecutors, primarily at the local level, have become the official policy of the federal government of the United States. When I say more direct, during the Obama administration, when FPF was founded, we were seeing a drastic spike in prosecutions of whistleblowers, people who had leaked information to the press. That, of course, silences the press because if you don't have sources, you can't report. If you don't have whistleblowers, you can't report. Confidential sources are the lifeblood of investigative journalism. But there was sort of an understanding that escalating to the point of going after a journalist directly crossed a red line. An exception was made for Julian Assange, but the Obama administration recognized that even going after Julian Assange, whether or not you view him as a traditional journalist, posed enormous risks to press freedom at large. Biden administration, on the other hand, and the first Trump administration saw it differently. The first Trump administration didn't care about going after journalists directly, wasn't concerned about chilling the free press, saw that as a benefit, not a cost. The Biden administration, on the other hand, told us that, well, Julian Assange is a unique case. He is not like other journalists. His news gathering methods, the publication WikiLeaks, were unique and unconventional, and that tactics used against him would not be employed against traditional journalists. Now, fast forward to today, we are seeing the WikiLeaks case cited to justify attacks on traditional journalists, to justify the seizure of terabytes of files from a Washington Post reporter, Hannah Natanson. You know, you can't get more mainstream than that. And to characterize those files as contraband and to ignore federal law specifically intended to avoid newsroom raids. What starts as small town sort of Reno 9/11 Keystone Cop shenanigans now is federal policy. A few years ago, we saw a raid of a newsroom in Marion, Kansas, a town of 2,000 people, and it was headline news. You know, people were outraged. It was unthinkable almost at the time that that would happen at the federal level. Well, now that is happening at the federal level. Another way I think things have kind of changed is that we have in the past seen anti-press antics tested first on the fringes before they reach the mainstream. We're sort of seeing the opposite approach now. I think it's largely because of Donald Trump's character. He's a product of the 1980s. He thinks about the news. He thinks of the New York Times, CNN, ABC. He's not so much thinking about Dropsite or The Intercept or The Nation or these more niche publications. So he wants to make a splash. He wants to make headlines. He's going after the big names first. That doesn't make it any better or worse, but it does mean that it gets some more attention and that the industry, the money spending at least, has a stake in the issue that maybe it didn't have when these things were primarily a worry for independent reporters, alternative press, people more on the fringes. And then it's not to oversimplify, but things are just more egregious than they used to be. We'd never before had a sitting president filing slap suits seeking $60 billion of damages total against news outlets. That would have been absurd in the past, not because past presidents wouldn't have wanted to do stuff like that, but because they would have assumed they couldn't get away with it. They would have thought that there would be political blowback if they went and sued media outlets claiming exponentially higher numbers and damages than their own net worths. We've never before seen anyone weaponize the Federal Communications Commission the way that the Trump administration has as a censorship police, essentially. We've never seen a case like Don Lemon and Georgia Fort being indicted on conspiracy charges for merely covering a protest, or like the Prairie Land case, where transporting zines was evidence of a conspiracy to commit a crime that the zines did not discuss or reference or even contemplate. And the list goes on. And of course, before all of this, starting with the Biden administration, we had the US government's willingness to tolerate atrocities towards the press in Gaza, which sort of sets the table for indifference to press freedom at home. So we're dealing with a scale and depth of attacks on press freedom that I don't think has any comparables in recent history.
Since January 20th, 2025, what's the most consequential thing that you've worked on, and why would you think it's consequential?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there are a couple of ways to measure it. You can look at it in terms of the number of journalists and the audience impacted, in which case I would talk about the weaponization of the FCC under Brendan Carr. I would talk about the Paramount merger, the Ellisons' attempt to take control of so many news outlets and use them to curry favor with Donald Trump. But when you think about just the sheer egregiousness of press freedom violations we've seen since last January, the one that always comes to mind is Ramisa Öztürk, because it doesn't get more blatant than that. Someone who did nothing but co-author a relatively tame op-ed that was critical of government policy is nabbed off the street by masked abductors, having no idea whether she was being kidnapped or what, and jailed for several weeks, held in awful conditions, with the government attempting to kick her out of the country. She, of course, was here as a Tufts University student on a valid student visa, had never had any issues before. The government had absolutely no proof that she was tied to any sort of nefarious activity, and eventually was forced to admit that after memoranda confirming it were leaked. So when we say most consequential thing, yeah, if you're thinking of the numbers impacted, it might be something that's in the headlines more. But when you're talking about just something that's emblematic of the extent to which we have slipped when it comes to our regard for the First Amendment, our respect for people's freedom to speak their minds, it's really got to be the Ramisa Öztürk case. And that's not to diminish the significance of any of the other similar cases involving immigrants, involving people who were punished for their pro-Palestine speech. That case, though, is just particularly bulletproof in the sense of there is no way any good faith, reasonable person could view that as anything but a direct attack on someone voicing an opinion the government didn't like. There's no pretexts, no excuses. It's just, naked and bare retaliatory censorship that, in addition to the chilling effect on all of us, took such an enormous toll on the victim herself.
I remember when she was first picked up that it was disturbing because it was during the month of Ramadan. And I kept wondering, was she able to break her fast? When is the next opportunity that she would have been given to? Mahsa Khanbabai, who is also one of her attorneys, was interviewed by the New York Times, and she said that after the judge ordered her release, ICE ERO agents wanted to put on an ankle bracelet. And she's like, that's not part of the deal. Just the idea that there is no limitation on what they believe their authority to be. Like we were talking about before we started, so many things that we think are crazy and astonishing are in fact the word that Nora used, completely normalized. So Nora, your work increasingly sits at the intersection of constitutional law, tech, democracy, and civil rights. What's the question you find yourself returning to that you think the rest of us aren't asking yet?
I think less and less about the law and less about tech by themselves. And I honestly think about us as humans. And my question is often now, are people aware? And is our passive or implicit inaction support for the environment we are in? So I are not aware of the broader political environment or actively choose to opt out of knowing, seeing, reading. And I sit with this, what I think is honestly a psychological question. And I'm not a psychology expert, but that's what I now think about over and over. Because constitutional law, while gripping for someone like me, is perhaps like a bedtime story that lulls you to sleep for most people. And if you get going on the authoritarian tech compact that allows for mass surveillance, again, people will feel like, am I in a sci-fi book? Like, what are we doing? But I think at the end of the day, my question is always, do people want this? Do people want there to be a pocket of society that is dehumanized? And do they want that only because they don't know how to respond? Do they not know what to do? I think a lot about our implicit inaction, the kind of things that just happen, that just over there when we're not looking. And maybe that's a little poetic, but I believe that that is the question we all will have to face over the coming years as we see the entire world gripped by an increasingly dictatorial grip and the environment that is not conducive for debate or curiosity. Because dissent is a fun word for me, and I know for Seth, but dissent, when I tell people what I do, a lot of people say, thank you for your service. Let's change topics. And that's what I sit with all the time. I know that a lot of Americans, study after study, are showing that if they have to deal with solutions that they would be involved in, they would prefer a dictator over democratic values, just increasingly. And I see that everywhere. Now, I don't think people in acute ways want injustice. They don't want to see a video of someone being killed and support it. But I think in the absence of acute awareness or being forced to examine something, people prefer to go about their lives. And that cannot last.
It's so true. Obviously, October 7th and the many months following were so intense. And I would have lunch with my friends, could not have a conversation about it. And I just ended up cutting people off because I thought if I can't have a conversation with you about a genocide and we can't call it that, then I can't even continue to be friends with you. So building on that, Nora, speaking of bedtime stories, you authored Chokehold, your 2025 Free Press report documenting the Trump administration's systematic assault on the First Amendment. More recently, Free Press published another report documenting how media companies colluded with the administration to silence dissents. What has doing this body of work taught you?
Well, thank you for naming these reports. I am really proud of my work and Free Press's work documenting the general decline and our declining commitment to First Amendment principles, to independence of the media, and our commitment broadly to diversity. Honestly, doing this work was horrible. I'm just being really honest with you. When I wrote Chokehold, that was my attempt to understand and examine whether the Trump administration was in fact more hostile as we often felt over 2025, and whether that hostility was legitimate vis-a-vis the First Amendment. I examined over 500 incidents of censorial attacks or attempts to muzzle protest, press, law firms, corporate entities, universities, students, professors, you name it. And I went a little crazy. The people who love me around me said, you really sound like one of those crazy people, as I was making sense of what I was observing and analyzing. And I whittled down that set of about 500 or so incidents to roughly 200 that I felt were really the conclusive examples of what the administration was doing in its first year back in office to aggressively undermine the First Amendment and to go after dissent. Then, when we began examining the more specific media capitulation methods, it felt like part of one larger agenda, which is the agenda that I think we see with all authoritarian regimes. Day one, they try to oppress and muzzle the press. They go after dissent and our sense of history. Like, is there an official history? Trump is rewriting it. He's removing placards at parks that portrayed U.S. history too negatively. Many of those, of course, include Native American retellings of their own attacks and being murdered. We've seen, of course, then the way that again and again, corporate media has been largely willing to go along with this reframing, recasting of the historiographic record. Seth and I have done a lot of work together on this broader set of threats because I think it's the independent journalists that are actually with the most to lose that do the most labor to counter what is largely a capitulating bending of the knee that corporate media entities have consistently shown willingness to do. They curry favor with the president, they cut checks for him, They've settled lawsuits. All of the social media companies settled lawsuits after they removed Donald Trump following January 6th of 2021. Just by comparison, Bolsonaro, the former president of Brazil, similarly encouraged and incited a coup in Brazil. And yet the Supreme Court charged and convicted him of huge sentences for his efforts to undermine the democracy there and the lawful turning over of different presidential powers. And so I often juxtapose those. Like, we have a country that was willing to hold a president accountable, and we have a media here that was largely willing to bolster and boost up a president that had helped incite the insurrection. Countless more examples, but all of the knot of this strategy, Miriam, really comes back to what are these corporate entities willing to do? And what it looks like they want is more power and to build their own purse strings. And so they have chosen that in favor of giving communities news that they can use to critically report on what the administration is doing. I waited, it took nearly 2 hours after a man was shot and killed by ICE in Houston. It took nearly 2 hours for the New York Times to actually post about it. And I was just appalled, wondering when would this become an issue? It has ripples throughout the way that people are aware of what's happening and the way that they might actually continue living without awareness.
You brought up a couple of things that I want to actually address with Seth. You've talked about censorship and you've talked about what that means in terms of these powerful conglomerates and the choices that they're making. So, Seth, I want to see if there's a through line. Governments rarely announce that they're punishing someone because of speech. We see immigration enforcement, licensing decisions, regulatory action, surveillance, funding restrictions. Are we witnessing a deliberate shift toward indirect forms of censorship?
I think we're witnessing a deliberate shift towards direct forms of censorship. This government does announce it's punishing people because of speech. The administration is attempting to manufacture exceptions to the First Amendment for categories of speech that it finds particularly inconvenient. That can mean pro-Palestine speech, which has always sort of been regarded as an exception. It can mean anti-ICE speech. It can mean speech that's simply critical of Donald Trump, or it can mean speech that is supportive of quote unquote Antifa, an amorphous concept that doesn't actually exist as an organized, centralized entity, and that Trump can continue to expand as he sees fit and as is convenient to him. Now he's trying out communism, which he's similarly defining to mean essentially anyone who says stuff he doesn't like. It bears very little relation to Marxist theory or anything like that. He's just using it as shorthand for the same thing as Antifa for people who don't like him and who he doesn't like in return. And the administration's being fairly open about their intention to censor that speech. When Brendan Carr sends his letters of inquiry to media outlets that have offended the president, he just says, I don't think that your reporting advances the public interest. And I, Brendan Carr, the guy who's wearing this Donald Trump lapel pin on my suit and sipping from a cup of coffee with a picture of Donald Trump walking me in the form of a leashed pit bull. That's Brendan Carr himself has said that. I am in a position to arbitrate bias, arbitrate public interest reporting. That is pretty clearly a direct punishment for speech. We mentioned Uzturk and the other immigration cases. Those are direct attacks on speech. And there's been an effort to categorically exclude non-citizens from the protection of the First Amendment. That's a position that the government has taken plainly. When you talk about their effort to expand the concept of doxing to mean identifying public officials, identifying ICE agents. The other day, they went to a polling station to harass and threaten an individual who had simply reposted the Minnesota Star Tribune's article, which identified Renee Good's killer. That is lawful, constitutionally protected speech. We don't have secret police in this country. We're allowed to identify public officials, particularly those who are at the center of major national news stories, particularly those who shot and killed somebody. But the administration is not hiding the fact that it is pursuing people based solely on that constitutionally protected speech. It is attempting to sort of rewrite the definition of doxing in the mind of the public to create this sort of cultural acceptance of the notion that we cannot identify law enforcement officers. That, I think, is part of what's really scary about these attacks, is that where the administration knows it can't win in court, because it hasn't compromised the judiciary to the extent that it needs to win some of these really extreme cases that it wants to bring. It is instead taking its case to the court of public opinion. As Nora was saying earlier, most people don't have a strong appreciation of the First Amendment, don't know a whole lot about constitutional law, don't know a whole lot about the role of journalism. So when you say something like identifying law enforcement agents creates a safety risk and you shouldn't be allowed to do it, or when you say something like newspapers publishing leaks from Pentagon employees about war plans compromises national security, if you're someone who's not really familiar at all with the First Amendment and with the principles it stands for, that kind of makes sense on a very gut level. So it's not that hard to create this notion in the zeitgeist that journalism, common routine journalistic techniques, is wrong or illegal. And that in and of itself creates a chilling effect. It leads to legal wins because bad judges are susceptible to the same cultural brainwashing that regular folks are. You'd be surprised, or well, you two wouldn't, but a lot of people would be surprised how many judges don't know the first thing about the First Amendment. So it creates bad law because it infects the mind of bad judges, and eventually it'll get to the good judges too, because the law does sort of follow the culture. So I think we'll be dealing with the ramifications of that shift long after this administration.
Nora, Seth corrected me, and appropriately so. It is direct and it is censorship. And he also touched on the immigration cases that you and I have both had a hand in. I had Sami Hamdi, I had Yaqub Ira, you had Mahmoud Khalil, Mario Guevara. And I know this seems like a straightforward question, but obviously the defense argued that there was a retaliatory use of immigration enforcement against journalists and advocates. Were we right? How right were we?
I remember when I was at South by Southwest last year, actually, and I was in my Airbnb and I got the news alert on my phone that someone named, I didn't even really know how to pronounce his name at the time, but Mahmoud Khalil, that's how I was saying it in my mind. I later learned how to pronounce it better, but that he had been picked up and was not able to be found. He was at the time a graduate student at Columbia and had been an immigrant to the United States, but was originally on a visa and then got a green card and was taken into custody and into a detention facility for his association with a set of views, and particularly those views supporting the human dignity of Palestinians, the right that Palestinians have to live. And I remember thinking to myself, this is it. This is the case. And of course, it was meaningful working on that case and working to get Mahmoud released. But there were then so many cases that followed, so many cases in which the administration used immigrants as tests for rarely used or novel legal arguments. And they always made it about immigration or about the criminality of the individual, or that the person had years prior done some weird little logistic, administrative, or bureaucratic error in their paperwork. The State Department has tried lots of different avenues. I almost feel like it's like an attempt to get around the actual First Amendment issues that are at play in each of these cases. But all they're really doing is creating the body of cases in hopes to legitimize removal of speech and association for unsavory or critical views. And of course, it began with immigrants who were fighting for Palestinian rights and human dignity. And I think from there, it moved very quickly into the Latino and Central American journalists and others who have been reporting on ICE, those cases, whether it's Mario Guevara, Sami Hamdi, Mahmoud Khalil, or Rameza Ozturk. And there are more and more of these. I always try to say all of their names because it risks normalizing if we only mention one with like a broad brush. Each of these cases are deeply troubling. And I think that they point towards a willingness by the administration to manufacture. And it really stuck with me that that was the word Seth used in his last comment, that there's an attempt to manufacture enemies for really just free speech and association. But of course, it is most aggressively targeting now immigrant subjects. And between your work, Miriam, which I'm so happy and honored to know, as well as what we've done at Free Press, it feels like a drop in the bucket. It feels like sometimes we're taking a mop to the ocean because the administration at this point seems quite willing to falsify records. There have been independent studies by NYU professors looking at hundreds of cases in which the federal government is one of the named parties, and the lawyers for the federal government in many, many cases have been willing to lie on the record to the point where judges point it out. They say, like, you are lying. You are undoing decades of trust between the federal government and our judiciary. How is that playing out? Mahmoud Khalil's case is still going on. The administration is relentless in its effort to remove him. And I think they will continue to be relentless in the effort to remove and go after others. Of course, those will likely be immigrants, but I think we'll reach a point in which it won't just be immigrant subjects. It will be the Prairie Land case. It will be the Minnesota 15. It will be more and more kind of onion effect where more of us are not just unsafe, but we are actively attacked for what has for centuries been protected speech and the ability to associate with ideas. And so I think there's this new proactive and aggressive element at play. It isn't just the tacit viewpoint discrimination case that I see and I'm still troubled by, but it is the ongoing, persistent, pervasive attack on what is barely, tentatively oppositional speech, whether it's online or in the real world.
It's most troubling to me that the people who are affected, once they are removed from this country, don't really have any recourse to come back. The damage feels so devastatingly permanent. That part stays with me a lot. And you said mop to the ocean. I've been saying that we're brushing sand at the beach. I want to talk about your book, but before we do that, I want to talk to Seth about what private power looks like. How much of today's speech environment, Seth, is shaped by private power, media companies, tech platforms, advertisers, and investors? As we watch companies like Warner Brothers, Paramount reshape the media landscape, what are we looking at? And when the Department of Justice simultaneously approves media mergers while prosecuting journalists, how do we make sense of that? How do we understand market consolidation and government pressure as separate threads, or are they just mutually reinforcing ones? And tell us about what's happening with Block the Merger.
The First Amendment is premised on an assumption that the press will actually want to exercise its rights. I don't know that the First Amendment really contemplates a scenario where a media executive walks into a meeting with representatives of a presidential administration and says, we want to get a corporate transaction and we are willing to tell the news in a way that you're comfortable with in order to accomplish that, where editorial content becomes a negotiating chip for purpose of advancing somebody's financial interest. So that's what we're seeing now, and it's really bizarre and alarming.
And let's name it, Seth. You've been an integral part of efforts that are watching very closely what happened at CBS after Barry Weiss took the reins.
I'm not really surprised by any of it, going ahead and firing so many folks at 60 Minutes at once. Maybe that was a little more brazen than I would have expected, but I wouldn't call it all that alarming. We saw from the outset that Paramount's merger with Skydance was tainted. In order to get that merger through, CBS settled an absolutely frivolous lawsuit by Donald Trump for $16 million. 2 days later, Brendan Carr, the FCC chair, approved the merger. The quid pro quo couldn't be more obvious. Subsequently, we learned that additional promises beyond the transaction of money were part of that quid pro quo. David Ellison and his father Larry, who control Paramount, promised the administration that they would commit to fair and unbiased reporting, which in the views of the administration means reporting that is not critical of the administration, that they would hire a bias ombudsman to oversee bias at CBS and essentially answer to Brendan Carr. And of course, instead of picking some experienced journalist for that role, they chose a career partisan and Trump loyalist with absolutely no qualifications to monitor bias at CBS or anywhere. So against that backdrop, it's hard to be surprised. But, the reason I wasn't naming names is that it's not just a CBS issue. We're seeing on a broader scale that whereas in the past, media companies had an economic interest in a strong First Amendment because the goods they were selling were news stories. And I'm not at all saying that past media moguls were angels by any means, or that there was some utopian heyday of the media. But at least if you own a news company, you have some incentive to stick up for the First Amendment because you can't put out your product without the legal protections the First Amendment affords you. If, on the other hand, you own a theme park company or you own a movie studio that just happens to have a news company under its umbrella, then the incentive structure is different. You are willing to throw journalism under the bus to advance your other interests. And if, let's say, in addition to your movie studio, your dad owns a company, let's say called Oracle, that envisions a future where it is the orchestrator of a global AI-driven surveillance system, then you might have motivations that go beyond the interests of your news company or your movie studio or the Trump administration. Larry Ellison is not guaranteeing this Paramount merger with $40 billion of personal equity, more than, despite his vast wealth, more than his cash on hand. He is not doing that just for the privilege of kissing up to a lame duck president for 2 years. He is doing that because it will grant him control of the narrative, control of the culture well into the future between CNN, CBS, HBO, the stake in. If you're someone who wants to sell the public on giving up its civil liberties and being surveilled by Oracle, it is quite helpful to have control over the press. You can push law and order narratives. You can stir up paranoia about crime, about terrorism. You can platform war hawks. You can bury whistleblowers who come forward about surveillance abuses. The possibilities are endless. So for those who say, well, why would the Ellisons go through all this trouble just to kiss up to Donald Trump? Yeah, they wouldn't. There's an end game that goes well beyond Donald Trump, and Donald Trump's corruption just affords them an opportunity to set those wheels in motion.
Narrative is priceless. And so people who have the ability to buy it gain everything. Seth, in terms of block the merger, do you believe that the attorney generals, whether that's Bonta in California or the one out of Oregon, and these people that have some connection to power brokers in the UK, will hold any power to stop this dead in its tracks? And what shape does that power actually take? It seems, as an outsider looking in, that that's not going to be enough to stop what's already in motion.
I'd never want to place too much trust in attorneys general or in politicians. They do have powers to investigate. The merger is not a done deal. They do have powers to block it. They should exercise those powers. They should seek to stop the merger, and I'm hoping they will. There are strong indications that they're planning to. We saw both from the UK and from the state of Oregon that action seemed to be in motion. What I think is important beyond their merely initiating the process is they're not folding, because there are separate components to the block the merger campaign. There is the component that is dealing with Hollywood, and there's the component that's dealing with press freedom. And there's certainly overlap because both Hollywood and journalism are part of this narrative and depend on the First Amendment, but there are also separate economic components. So my concern is that an AG is going to settle their claims in exchange for a commitment to, say, a certain number of theatrical releases per year, something that benefits the film industry economically, which is great. I certainly want the film industry to benefit economically, but an AG can probably fall into the trap of reaching a settlement like that, sort of claiming a win, getting good headlines that they forced a concession, and moving on with their political career. So even assuming that they do go forward with a challenge, which I'm certainly hoping they will, we need to keep the pressure on. And beyond keeping the pressure on them, people with standing to not wait on the government to take action themselves, shareholders who can bring derivative actions and demand information, as Freedom of the Press Foundation is exploring doing, consumers who live in jurisdictions with favorable consumer fraud laws, with private rights of action that they may be able to avail themselves of. There are remedies available to common people, and I hope they'll exercise them. And that goes back sort of to your question, Miriam, of whether most people appreciate and care about this stuff. I'm hoping they do, and I think we're seeing some evidence that they do. All of those people who are outside protesting Jimmy Kimmel being attacked by the FCC, I think are people who are legitimately offended by the administration's attempt to censor speech. And it just took that element of celebrity to activate them and bring it onto their radar. And I think our job is to show people that it doesn't only matter when there is a name that they have heard before involved. And it doesn't only matter when the victim of censorship is someone who they agree with politically, because nobody should harbor any illusion that once the Trump administration creates these precedents and these powers and this new leverage to censor speech, that the next Democratic administration won't use them. Might scale back, might not do the really blatant, tacky, sort of clownish stuff that Trump is doing, all the tweets and calling people traitors and the all caps stuff. And probably the next FCC chair won't be quite as facially censorial as Brendan Carr is, but neither political party is likely to intentionally relinquish censorship powers.
I've watched you being very active on this front with the merger, and you are amazing, Seth. Nora, you're writing a book, Law, Technology, Democracy, Free Expression. I remember when you told me you had to live through and with some of the ugliness of its chapters. What were you sitting with when you were writing those chapters? And without giving away too much, what have you discovered that you most want to give us as your readers?
Well, I don't want to give away too much, but the book is about free speech and democratic weakening while we as communities are distracted, whether it's little fun, banal things over here or distracted by the news of the day that is metaphorically punching us in the face hour by hour. I believe it gives authoritarians a window in which to grab and grow power. And what I'm sitting with is the severity question. And we've been dancing around it in this conversation, even how to describe the severity of what is happening. There are no words at times. We keep saying it's unprecedented, it's relentless, it's aggressive, they're manufacturing. And so there's a scale of severity and a pace of attack that I am attempting in my book to describe. That means that I'm sitting with really horrible things, is the truth. And in the book, what I really explore is a kind of new brutal politics that are crushing our potential engagement with the world. And I don't think that the book will solve everything, but free speech books are typically written by white men. And I'm so proud to be a Latina woman writing a book about the way that dissent and minority voices are attacked and are systematically undermined and dehumanized and obliterated. But to do that, it's honestly been a really gross process because it's like living through all of the ways that these attacks play out in real lives. To look at victims of attacks and to live through their stories and to try to tell those with some sense of justice and responsibility has been almost sickening. I don't want readers to come away sickened only. I believe firmly the reason I'm writing the book, and I honestly think the reason that Seth and you and myself do what we do is because we do feel there is light somewhere. Maybe it's not the end of the tunnel, but it's somewhere in the dynamic. And that is worth spotlighting. Even the title of your podcast is a challenge to people that if you can witness what is happening, what must you also be called in to do? And that can't just be to lay witness and nothing more. It has to be to take action in some way.
We cannot wait to get our hands on it. Chokehold was a revelation. It was dark, but it was so necessary. I love what you said, that we do what we do because in doing our part, that will ultimately lead to betterment for others. Speaking of others, I actually met someone through Seth that I think is kind of a special guy, Jeremy Busby. And I feel like he's had a significant impact on you, Seth. He's an incarcerated journalist in Texas. Tell me a little bit about how you two first came to know each other. I had seen the piece that you guys published with respect to the Prairie Land sentencing.
So Jeremy, I believe, first had someone email, since he doesn't have access to email himself, Freedom of the Press Foundation's informational email address about retaliation he was enduring for the journalism that he was doing and seeking legal counsel at the time. I got back to him and I said, I'm not licensed to practice law in Texas, so I can't really help you there. But if you want to write about your experiences, I'd be happy to review an article or a pitch. And he did write about his experience. We published it. We published several other articles from Jeremy on our own site. We collaborated with Jeremy on some articles for other outlets like the Intercept. Started talking to him more regularly. He founded a nonprofit called Join Jeremy. I joined the board of that nonprofit, the objective of which is to platform incarcerated journalists, to allow incarcerated journalists a seat at the table on a regular basis. For a long time, it has been this sort of sporadic, hey, here is your semi-annual reminder that things are bad behind bars. There needs to be more than that. There are 2 million people incarcerated in the United States. They need to be platformed more frequently and more in depth, not just these overview pieces. Technology now allows for the profiteering that goes on when it comes to incarcerated people communicating with the outside world. Every time I talk to Jeremy, it costs one of us money. Every time I send a message, it costs money. If I want to communicate with another incarcerated person using the same exact applications Jeremy uses, I need to buy a whole new book of digital stamps to communicate with that person, because Jeremy's digital stamps can only be used for Jeremy. That's a whole other episode. We can get into all that. But despite all of those obstacles, technology allows incarcerated people to call into a radio show, to appear on a podcast, to write an op-ed that is on topic and part of the news cycle. I think the reason it doesn't happen more isn't so much malice, it's that editors don't really think about it. Editors don't think, hey, let me get an incarcerated journalist to write a reaction to the Prairieland case or to even the Paramount merger. You know, Jeremy wrote a great piece about what happened inside prison when media options were limited. He's incarcerated in Texas. Essentially, Fox News and televangelical channels were the only thing available for a while, whereas NPR and other outlets had been an option previously. And people, not only their politics changed, but their sense of self-worth changed, their view of criminal justice. They started believing themselves deserving of the treatment they were receiving because they made some sort of mistake, oftentimes decades earlier. So incarcerated people have unique perspectives on things like that, and they can be part of the day-to-day news cycle. They're still reading about the outside world, and they have a lot to tell us, especially as some of the issues that they've faced for years come to affect the rest of us. You mentioned the Sanchez case, and right, Jeremy's reaction there was to say, well, criminalization of literature is nothing new to me. People inside have been placed in solitary confinement and otherwise punished because of the literature they possess for as long as we can remember. Before that, slaves were given copies of the Bible without the Exodus story because it was thought that it might incite a rebellion. When it comes to conditions in various ICE facilities that are really appalling, Jeremy can talk about that. Incarcerated people in general can talk about that in a way that others can. I was puzzled when I started hearing from Sammy and others about the severe stomach digestive issues they would have when they began eating the food in ICE jails. And I asked Jeremy what he thought about it. And he explained to me that, well, for prisons, their whole system of agriculture is different. They're using different canneries and different farms that don't comply with the same standards as those on the outside. You know, he used to work in the prison kitchen. He was talking about opening these industrial sized cans and finding dead rodents in them. So then it makes a whole lot more sense how Sammy and others could become violently ill upon eating this food. So there's so many insights that people in Jeremy's position have, and it's just been an honor and a pleasure to work with him and learn from him.
He's a person with exceptional insights, and being able to watch the two of you work together has been a pleasure. It's interesting that you said the news they were being fed informed their sense of self, understanding that limiting their choices actually limited their own perception of self-worth. I've never really given that much thought, and have clients who tell me regularly that the food they are given came out of a can that has expired. So that explains why they're getting stomach aches while they're watching television screens of just scrumptious foods. Nora, with respect to the Prairie Land defendants and the concept that possessing literature constitutes criminal conduct and that there was material support for terrorism among an internal domestic group. Response? I don't even know what kind of a question I could ask about that because it's appalling that somebody could get a 30-year sentence. And Seth and I had talked about the personalities behind that because the National Lawyers Guild had written up kind of a dossier, if you will, of acts the judge had taken that were so egregious. And we're talking about federal judges, right? Just a response, Nora, I don't know what to make of it. What do you make of it?
Well, you only have to make an example of a few people in order for a large populace to consider and think twice about their actions. Authoritarians only
It's
have to scare
interesting
a
you
few
say
of
that,
us.
Nora. Let me just interrupt because I want to hear the rest of that. But because of this new nonprofit that we're developing, and we had given it this flashy anti-ICE legal defense name, once that conviction was handed down, we literally said to ourselves that, well, in light of what happened to the Prairie Land defendants, we might want to soften that and make it this, immigration rapid response initiative. That just sounds a lot more palatable. So go
It's
ahead.
funny you
Yes,
say
I
that
agree.
because, I have a marketing brain. I can't help it. And I have been thinking a lot about the title of your nonprofit. And I always pause so we can talk separately and you can edit this out. But yes,
Or maybe not.
maybe no, I'm always
If
on the
there's
record.
anything. Okay, so yes.
Well, so about Prairie Land, you only have to make an example of a few people for more of us to think twice, for more of us to be like, ooh, maybe I don't want to go to prison for 100 years. Maybe I won't. And then you plug and play. Think of the example. Maybe I won't post online that I don't like what ICE is doing. Maybe I won't go to a rally. Maybe I won't attend a demonstration outside of a detention facility. I think that the Prairie Land case is setting an example. And I think it is one of several big cases now setting examples so that more of us are afraid. I also think it's very clever timing by the administration to be doing this the summer before the midterms, where there are many contested races, both for congressional seats and the GOP holding power, where Trump himself increasingly is trying to sway the other branches of government, and where we know that midterms can actually really serve as an inflection point ahead of larger elections down the line, kind of setting the political tenor. We know that there is suppression every summer before elections. That's really a hallmark. So to me, it's really clever that the administration is making this large campaign a bigger deal to manufacture enemies. And I think they're doing this to manufacture enemy movements. So any typical free speech and constitutionally protected activity might now come under scrutiny of the Justice Department and other agencies. To give you just a little bit of background, the Prairie Land case happened about a year ago on July 4th, 2025. Anti-ICE protests happened outside of the Prairie Land detention facility in Texas. The event was intended to show solidarity with detainees because the facility there in Alvarado, Texas had horrific conditions. And Seth explained some of what these conditions can be like. We know also from Delaney Hall and the protests outside there that, one woman suffered a miscarriage while in detention. Worms and other disgusting maggots were in people's food. People were ill. We've seen other testimony from people released from detention facilities where they said their hands were tied behind their backs and they were forced to drink water with their mouths on the ground. I tell these only because in witnessing and documenting what is happening, these specific can help us, can help put a spotlight on really what's going on. When you just say facility detention conditions are awful, it's like, what does that mean? The Prairie Land case escalated and an officer was shot and wounded by one of the protesters. That set off a chain of Justice Department aggressions in the way that the cases were then prosecuted, because the Justice Department repeatedly described a large set of defendants as members of an Antifa cell. Antifa doesn't exist as a group and a specific term. Antifa refers to anti-fascism. And so to legitimize this terrorism theory that Antifa cell was a terrorist group, Prosecutors relied on evidence that included people circulating political literature and magazines, or what people call zines. That's the big one that's been in headlines. There were activities of people belonging to left-wing book clubs. People communicated on encrypted platforms together, sharing information, literally just sharing information. Protesters planned and distributed materials about what protest rights look like. Those are the kind of things that I've done throughout my career, and maybe Seth or you have. All of these are core associational rights. And when the sentencing came down in all of these cases, the different defendants were sentenced to anywhere from 30 to 100 years in prison. And it's of note that the judge did something really unusual. The judge stacked sentencing for different crimes that these people were convicted of consecutively, not concurrently, which is a very significant departure from the norm. And it has resulted in these very large sentences now. I just want to say one other thing about it, because hundreds of miles away, we have been seeing what is happening now with a different set of groups, and that is the Minnesota 15. Operation Metro Surge was a huge federal immigration effort to deploy law enforcement in Minnesota in late 2025 and 2026. Federal agents arrested thousands of people. They tried to remove or detain immigrants, and agents killed two civilians, Renee Good and Alex Pretty, during that Metro Surge operation. Arising out of the demonstrations where people were so upset about the way ICE and federal agents were behaving, prosecutors have charged 15 people with felony charges, all federal charges, saying that they were associated with, again, these kind of terroristic-like groups. And in the indictment, they include the signal names of the people, which I think is a way of suggesting nothing we do is protected or private anymore. The government is basically saying, whatever you're doing on an encrypted platform, we're watching it. And the allegations really are, again, the most basic things, Miriam, like impeding. That is, if you impede federal investigations or federal officers, that's because you shared information in a group chat, or you organized a rapid response demonstration on a sidewalk, or tracked federal vehicles. These are now being considered, and I think the administration is trying to frame these as terroristic activities in the manner of manufacturing enemy movements, the way that we saw it during Vietnam War, any moment in history post 9/11, where there have been these dissenting groups that are emboldened and empowered to exercise their rights. And so it is no surprise to me that this is happening just months before everyone in this country who has the right to vote should be going out to vote. And to normalize the police presence, the visibility of people wearing masks, armed guns, and military gear, it kind of normalizes that their presence isn't inappropriate, but their presence is inappropriate. And the way that they behave, these agents and these agencies, is often unconstitutional. I don't want to say it's end times, because we have seen this before, but it is probably one of the most aggressive wake-up calls for all of us.
No, I learned so much from the both of you. I can't thank you enough for the extraordinary, bold, and brave work that you both do. I'm so grateful to be in this with you. And I want to thank you for bearing witness on this episode. I felt like I was just having coffee with really good friends who are super smart.
We're going to have to do it again.